I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Wendy Morgan is the Learning and Development Senior Strategist for Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She provides instructional design strategy for print, instructor-led, web-based, and blended approaches. This includes assessment of learner and business needs, identification of learning objectives, and design of corresponding assessments to ensure the desired level of understanding and behavioral change. It also includes the design of learner experiences that offer scenario-based, experiential learning, allowing concrete application of knowledge and skill. Welcome, Wendy. We're really glad you're able to join us today, and feel free to get started whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation. And thank you all for being here to hear about blended learning. It's really nice that we have kind of a small group. Maybe we can be a little bit informal, and we'll be able to be a little bit more social that way too. So before we get started, actually, why don't we take a poll? Let's kind of just take the pulse in the room, and I'm going to need Jamie or Leanne to pull the poll in for me because I don't see it. Awesome. All right, so what could cut the time required to achieve learning objectives by 75%? And here are your choices. See how you do. We've got blended learning, and yeah, I know I'm supposed to pick it up, but it's just not believable. Kind of running neck and neck here at the moment. All right, I'm going to end that poll now so that we can take. Are you guys seeing the results? Do you see the results? Broadcast the results. Okay. So I think we're ready to pull the poll off the screen at this point. It seems like, although we would like to believe that blended learning is going to be the thing that helps us achieve our learning objectives very quickly, there's some question about how effective it is. So let's just kind of explore that. Let's touch on that. So blended learning is defined as some kind of combination between a computer mediated and a face-to-face instructional element, and it's very popular. But how effective is it? I'm actually just reading in chat. I'm seeing, were you guys able to see the poll? It looked like it was a 60% said blended learning and 40% said that was kind of unbelievable. So it's exactly what we're touching on here in this session. So how effective is blended learning and why? Let's kind of examine that. So we've got a computer mediated component, and we've got a face-to-face mediated component, which holds a lot of promise for personalized instruction by capitalizing on the strengths of both e-learning and face-to-face instruction. However, it's typically been accompanied by a lack of learner accountability for or instructional commitment to the computer-mediated instructional components. So that results in what is essentially a reduced face-to-face instructional experience with optional digital add-ins. Now, it's very likely that technological constraints have contributed to that difficulty because learner activity from web-based modules has traditionally been limited to LMS protocols like SCORM, and therefore the resulting variables that you're getting may not have been conceptually meaningful or even maybe easily accessed outside the LMS environment. In order for blended learning to be effective, you need really good instructional design strategy behind it. So you need to be identifying measurable learning objectives. You need to make sure that these objectives meet the needs of both your learners and your organization, which requires a prior needs assessment. And you need to be constructing learner experiments. Don't do that. You want to be constructing learner experiences that are most likely to achieve those objectives. And you want to be using learner data for evaluation and tailored focus. So you use learner activity data from the first parts of your blended learning strategy to inform and tailor the later parts of your blended learning strategy. So you're taking existing knowledge into consideration to seamlessly blend those varied instructional components. But the first two parts of this strategy are difficult enough to do well. And the third is even more difficult for people who only have access to limited learner activity data that a traditional LMS environment provides. In contrast, the technical infrastructure that we created at FPG, or Frank Porter Graham, allows us to collect completely customizable learner activity data. So let's start off by me telling you a little bit about our organization and why we have that set up and why it works for us. So FPG is an organizational umbrella under which exist many different grant-funded projects. That means that for the 200 plus people that are employed at Frank Porter Graham, maybe 5 to 10 of them actually have a hard line position through the university. The rest of them are being funded almost entirely on what we would call soft money, which is grants, either national, state level, private foundation, but it's all, they're competing for grants every grant cycle, really, which is every year for sure. Some of the grants are 3, 5 years, but they're all grant-funded projects. Now, these projects are all tied together by their focus on child development, but there's many different aspects of child development, and our projects run the gamut. So we've got a firm for professionals over here, their logo on the left. They focus on autism. ICTP is an implementation capacity project focused on a scale-up of a community-focused program. xAPI is an implementation project focused on school programs and practices for K to 12. So there's a whole bunch of different types of projects under UNC. And the training that these projects provide is all external. It's all focused on the communities that they serve. So in our organizational context, where we have many diverse audiences that don't overlap, potentially unknown learners, an LMS just makes zero sense. It's also expensive, and there's no budget line in grants for LMSs or technology infrastructure like that. So we have an all xAPI LRS-based learning ecosystem for our e-learning activity data. And right away, that leapfrogs most of the technological constraints, holding back the potential for blended learning. So xAPI allows us to define and capture conceptually meaningful learner activity data variables that will inform face-to-face instruction. So let me walk you through one of them. To increase the effectiveness and efficiency of ICTP, that's this one in the middle here, to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of their on-site work, they're going out into different counties across North and South Carolina. The L&D team, which includes me, at FPG, advised them to use an innovative two-step blended learning strategy to custom tailor site support to the individual needs of learners that were evident in meaningful learner activity data collected from e-learning pre-work. This design was intended to decrease necessary on-site time, increase learner engagement, and also promote consistency of support quality by providing clear objectives and effective materials across all of their sites. Because we have different people supporting different sites, and this will help everything be consistent. But because I'm not reporting to the university or the projects about this, I'm going to give you guys the inside scoop about what was happening here. The ICTP project, remember all of these projects are independent projects. They have their own independent funding, so they all kind of function like little entrepreneurial businesses under this umbrella of FPG. And the leadership at ICTP is laissez-faire. And the culture at this project is that site support teams are very independent. So when we produced this blended learning strategy, most of the site support teams within the project simply chose not to take on the additional work of modifying their approach to utilize the new strategy. So it wasn't really going anywhere. But then the SMEs within the project, two particular people that we worked with to design this strategy, leapfrogged all of that reluctance by utilizing the tools and materials developed for on-site work within a webinar format to reach all of the sites at once prior to on-site work. So what they basically did was they followed L&D's original strategy with a minor change. They substituted the webinar for the on-site component and then did on-site support follow-up as needed. And the results were fantastic. Achievements of learning objectives, they took a quarter of the time that would have been necessary if we did it all on site, because we were reaching everybody at once with the e-learning, which didn't take any instructor time because it was pre-developed. And then the only instructor time was to the webinar, which was shorter as a result of having the e-learning pre-work. So learner interest and engagement were peaked enough to prompt independent support seeking, which actually is a huge deal within this line of work. And the site teams were provided with a huge head start that really reduced the need for follow-up support. And this blended learning strategy trifecta stemmed from a change management challenge. So here's clear proof that adversity grows innovation. Let me show you exactly what we do so that you could potentially bring this into your work. So first, we identified pertinent learning objectives and feasible methods of measuring their achievement. Then we developed a comprehensive plan along with supporting activities and tools, which included role plays, job aids, and workshops. And then with all of the learning objectives identified, we delineated the subset of learning objectives that we thought were going to be most feasible and useful to address first in an online format. Once those objectives were identified, we designed the module by planning the learner activity data that would guide the on-site work, as well as the custom learner interactions that would result in that data. We designed the e-learning course to allow learners to gain virtual hands-on experience with concrete skill application within a scenario-based narrative, and we included gamification elements such as persona identification. We made sure every significant learner behavior was captured in the form of xAPI statements reporting to FPG's LRS, and each data point was queried to a web-based form for review and or export. This is the web-based form right here, which you can see has kind of a lot in it. But we additionally created a custom report option within that query form, which we called a data dashboard, and that is sort of a summary of the activity broken down by learner objective or learning objective for each learner, indicating each learner's ability level with a simple red light, yellow, green light kind of data visualization. And then all the text entry that each learner provided was also available in this summary. So that's already a lot. I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions about the e-learning piece or this planning in general before I head over to the webinar component. Okay, so let's talk about the webinar then. To begin, the two SMEs that designed this webinar emailed written instructions to all of the sites with screenshots, directing them to complete the e-learning where the module was, and it gave them a deadline for completion. So kind of set them up for success. Then they provided a short series of 2 webinars, which were each about an hour and a half. And again, no more time was really required because they already had a head start on the topics from the e-learning. But then equipped with knowledge about the needs of each participating learner, the instructors custom tailored the first webinar according to the learner activity data in the data dashboard. So topics that were conveyed in the module and well understood were skipped. So that left time to review and emphasize topics that learners found difficult. They used these emphasis areas to guide not only what they said, the delivery of the content, but also the context sometimes of the scenarios. So for example, if a particular context seemed to be the issue, then they could provide that context and more practice with it. They utilized best practices in instructional design within this webinar format just as they would have on site, but they had the advantage of learner activity data too. So they elicited and documented learner questions, and then they utilized the activities and tools developed previously for on-site use with minor modifications, like sharing screens rather than hard copies. And they organized learners into breakout groups of 3 to 4 by the area of their need, and then they led each group through the role plays that we had designed earlier to address those needs, those specific types of needs. Then they facilitated follow-up discussion in breakout rooms before coming back together as a larger group to identify the lessons learned and some of the key takeaways. And the rich relationship building that was accomplished in that first webinar and the open discussion experiences provided the instructors with even more knowledge about the learners they were serving. So as a result, they're able to even further personalize that second webinar. And then following the second webinar series, webinar instructors shared notes from both of them with the site support teams about the needs, the ongoing needs of those teams. So after participation in the e-learning and the webinar series, learners demonstrated excitement and engagement, independently seeking more training and support. So this enhanced the ability of the site teams to efficiently and effectively achieve all of the learning objectives in less time. If you counted up all the time that would have been required to go to each one of these sites independently versus the way that we were able to go about it with an e-learning that could cut across everybody at their own on their own time, and then the webinar that was directed at everyone at once, it was a huge savings of time and effort. And as one example, one of the site teams had achieved almost all of their learning objectives by the time that the on-site support team needed to help them. So they started with this one site, this one county. The site support team began their support by creating specific tools in order to share assessment results that came from all of this training that you might have just kind of in passing seen that the training was about assessing capacity. They were creating specific tools to share results from their capacity assessments back to others. They were also identifying the best person to lead their assessment efforts, and then they were doing some action planning and database decision making following the analysis of assessment results. So that's where they began working with this site. So that's, when compared with the typical starting point, which is explaining basic foundational concepts, this progress seemed absolutely miraculous. And in some cases, following the e-learning and webinar engagement, the on-site support is just not needed. So given that success and the extended reach of the webinar format, this blended learning trifecta is now our new gold standard, the gold standard for ICTP and the gold standard for the L&D team, which serves all of FPG's projects, because it is a perfect solution to the limits that are presented by this quarantine working condition, and it's going to continue to be relevant even when we can all get together because it saves a ton of time and money. So with that, let's put up the poll again. What do you guys think now? We're having some poll troubles. I can't actually grab it. There we go. All right, I know you can do this poll. All right, we have 100% at blended learning so far. However, that's about half the people that responded before, which tells me that maybe there are some issues that, you might not believe that you would be able to um, enact this particular strategy. It may have to do with the way in which you collect learner activity data. I don't know, but I think that might be a discussion that is worth having within this group since we have the time and a small enough number of folks. All right, I'm going to give just a minute for some stragglers that want to put their vote in if possible, and then I think we should take this and start to talk about it and how you might be able to use this and maybe some low-hanging fruit or good, achievable, immediate next steps that you can take with this information. All right. So I've closed it. Now I've got the little check on my view that says broadcast results, which tells me you guys should be able to see it. Will you all tell me in the chat whether you can see this poll or not? Awesome. You can see poll but not results. Okay. So somebody's seeing results. Okay, all right, awesome. All right, thank you, Jim, for the results, and we were all in agreement. That is nice and concise, exactly what I needed. Okay, then I think we can pull the poll off and maybe open it up for discussion. Now, I know the webcam looks like it's off, but it's more helpful for me, or I know when I'm talking to people to maybe be able to see them. I don't know if we can turn the webcam on at this point so that people can see that I'm actually a human. But if not, that's okay too. So we've got 10 people that responded first, and it was about a 60-40 split between whether you thought blended learning would actually cut the time required to achieve your learning objectives and thinking, no, that'd be great, but it's really not believable, to 100% saying, yes, I think this is the way to go. But that 100% was only 6 out of 10 of the original folks. So what do you think might be the holdout? Is it the technological constraints that I was talking about earlier? Do you guys have the ability to collect xAPI data? Because I think we could discuss other ways or other types of data, that you could potentially use to accomplish some of these same results. All right, um, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to go back to an earlier slide about the key steps to achieving this. Oh, looks like I clicked too many times. There we go. So in order to actually achieve a time savings or cost savings that is associated with that, with blended learning, we need to be able to do each of these three things. We need to be able to identify measurable learning objectives that are meeting needs, because without that, nothing's going to help you. And we need to be able to construct learner experiences that are actually going to move the needle, because again, without that, you can't put two bad ingredients into a recipe and expect it to taste good, right? You have to put good ingredients into your recipe. So this is basically, make the right recipe and have the right ingredients. So you have to start there. But the focus really, which I think is the most difficult piece for a lot of people in this blended learning strategy, is to utilize learner data for evaluation. So what you really need to do if you don't have xAPI data like we do in this sort of complex and very customized way is think about what kind of data would help. So when you take your blended learning and you think, okay, well, I'm going to be doing this piece, I'm going to have 3 pieces to my blended learning. I'm going to have e-learning, I'm going to have webinar, and I'm going to have on-site, for example. Then what you need to do is think about what kind of data, maybe go backwards, would help your on-site, and that's the kind of data that you're going to want to be pulling out of your webinar. And what kind of data is going to help my webinar? That's going to be what you want to pull out of your e-learning. Remember that the very first thing that we did when we started to design this e-learning was to identify the learning objectives that we were going to attack in the e-learning and what the data was going to be that we pulled out of that e-learning to inform the later pieces. So whether or not you use xAPI data, you can measure what you need in some way. You can maybe do a survey, observational reporting. You can try to find what you need, maybe design a bunch of little micro-learning elements that test different things if completion is your only option in terms of learning activity data. But essentially, the major piece is to figure out what are you going to do with this data and how is it actually going to inform the way that your instruction unfolds in those later pieces. Though that's the real key. You want to be doing an enhancing blend. You don't just want kind of optional digital add-ins that actually reduce the efficacy of your later portions. What you want is enhanced learning. You want to enhance those later pieces. So you want to be figuring out what kind of data that you might want to pull together to inform those later pieces. So why don't we think about ways that you could actually take this and apply it to some of the challenges that you're facing right now. If you all can think about what kind of challenge do you think you might be able to attack with blended learning, we can figure out what the learner activity data might be that you want to pull into your later stages of blended learning. So how are you using blended learning right now? Let's start there. Or are you? Are you just kind of thinking about it? All right. Got a couple of good answers here. Dawn teaches at a high school. We haven't really used blended learning, but we're considering it for next year. Yes, I'm being pulled into a conversation at UNC actually in a couple of weeks about how we can take some of the wins from FPG's blended learning and apply it to the needs of the student population at UNC. And Jim, we do for our employee orientation, still in a classroom setting and e-learning for different aspects. So Jim, tell me more about that. So are you just doing e-learning for different aspects and then classroom setting for others so they're not really talking to each other, or are you actually blending these components together for the same learning objectives? Is there a way to turn on, let people use mics? It might be more efficient to not have people have to chat. We've only got about a group of 20, so it would be kind of nice to, just have a conversation.
Yeah, and if you need help
if that's possible.
enabling your audio, look
Awesome.
for the microphone
All right, Jim,
icon.
you should be able to talk.
Here we go. Aha.
Perfect.
Okay. So I think you can hear me now. Oh, okay. So yeah, so we use
So Jim, if you're able to
so
unmute,
the
I'd
employee
like to hear
orientation,
a little bit
well,
more about
up to
how you
this
blend
point.
those components.
So, about 20 people, 30
Yep, I sure
people in a
can.
classroom setting, but then they go through a sort of parallel tracks, I guess that would be the best way, right? So they're doing some content using e-learning, and then there's some that's instructor-led, and then they all get the same things, but it's just so that each group is smaller. So particularly in the instructor-led exercises, right, there's more participation. So I think, and so it's all aimed at the same learning objectives, which is to help people be great ambassadors of our institution, welcome guests, and all that type of thing. What we're looking at now is that going forward, that classroom and even the moderated e-learning may be a little challenging, if you will. So probably going to think closer to what you're at, kind of this curated web-based thing might be a helpful way to think about it.
Right. Yes. So, right. So it sounds like what you're doing is flipping the classroom, which is something that I would recommend to Dawn and others if you want to be starting to think about blended learning. But the problem that we are going to be facing in the fall, Dawn, and any others who are going to be in a university or other K to 12 or other educational setting, is that we don't have potentially the option of being as planned in our approach. Well, we can plan it, but it might not it might not unfold according to plan, because we can plan to do the e-learning first and then bring everybody into face-to-face. But what if we're back in a stay-at-home order during the face-to-face component? So that's when this sort of that's when this third option comes in really handy with this webinar. So essentially, it's just converting what you're going to be doing in a classroom to a webinar format. But if you're talking about converting synchronous activity to a different format of synchronous activity, that's a little bit lower of a hurdle at least than converting synchronous activity to asynchronous activity. And if you have the capacity to develop some asynchronous activity like this e-learning component that I kind of brought you guys through to preload, then it opens up that synchronous activity too. And I think if I understand correctly, Jim, that's kind of what you were talking about. That's that flipping the classroom. So essentially what you're doing with that e-learning component is you are front loading all of the information that everybody needs to hear so that you leave the space open for in that synchronous activity component for really diving into interaction and adaptation to the way that somebody in particular might need to apply the information. So that's where you want to be designing experiences that are interactive like role plays or workshops.
Right.
Whereas in the e-learning, you want to be trying to set it up to be as much of a virtual simulation of reality as possible,
where is
but
your
they're not
school? Where
interacting
are
with
you,
other
Dawn?
humans in this self-paced e-learning
If you don't mind me
component.
asking.
Um,
Oh, you
so
could probably talk too.
the
Anyway, but
hurdle,
she's
I think,
typing
for a
because
lot
she's
of high
good.
schools and universities.
Chelsea, okay, yeah. So I'm right in Dearborn. So I'm at the Henry Ford. So we should probably try and we could talk more.
All right, so um, Dawn, I'm actually, I think, going to be designing a PBIS e-learning for your area. So you should watch out for that. It's going to be a choose your own adventure. I'll have to, get in touch. I'll give you the URL and we put it out. But the problem that a lot of universities and high schools are going to have is that they don't have built-in capacity to develop this sort of asynchronous component because it takes a lot of time and development. And then they might not even have the timeline to be doing that. Certainly, they didn't have the timeline to do that for this spring. This was a sort of you convert your in-person classroom experience to a Zoom or webinar experience in 7 days, go. So part of this, what you're going to have to be facing in the fall is really studying up on how to convert and maybe taking that summertime to think about how you might be able to convert things to an online format. But as long as you can do it synchronously, it's going to be a little bit easier. The idea, though, is you might want to also create things that are asynchronous. So you may not be able to design a full e-learning experience, but you can easily put up like a SurveyMonkey survey, or I'm sure that whatever your school or district is, they have some way of surveying. I know that Zoom has polling. You can, if you have an LMS environment like in a university, you can put little quizzes up that aren't necessarily constructed as part of the grade, but you can write out a scenario, kind of like a word problem in math, write out a scenario and then ask them to make some choices. And then from that data, you can see what kinds of choices they would make, what are their common mistakes, and you can tailor your follow-up synchronous activity to address the actual issues that you see rather than just be giving everybody sort of the same. So you don't, in order to make your time more efficient and to make learners more engaged, skipping what they already know and really focusing in very specifically on the things that they don't know as well is going to be very, very helpful. So we have a little bit of time left. If anybody else wants to jump in and ask any more questions, I'm here. So I'm more than happy to help you think through some things or answer some questions. All right, then what I'd like to see you put into the chat, because I want to see you write it out and maybe develop some kind of commitment to it as we move forward, is what is your next step? What is your first action step that you intend to take with this information next week? What is one thing that you can do next week to move yourself further toward an effective blended learning design? And this can be anything. This can be, I'm going to write up a word problem type situation to test my students' ability to navigate when they should turn left instead of right. I am going to come up with a quiz that tells me which lessons I can skip. I am going to come up with a role play for my synchronous activity. I am going to come up with an interactive scenario that would follow 3 different interactive scenarios. I'll say I'm going to raise the bar, depending on how my data tells me to follow up by addressing needs. Essentially, you need to know what the needs are, how you're going to address those needs, and the blended learning is that you have 2 components. So Jim says he's going to take a portion of the classroom orientation and create an online interactive scenario for practicing communication skills. That would be great. It's a great one. That is ambitious, though, too. Just next week. Yes, I think that we could also, it can be less ambitious, too. It can just be, I am going to figure out how to write a quiz that will give me some useful data. I will create a blended learning scenario to 2 or 3 components and the goals of each one. Perfect. You got to know your goals first. This is the list up here. This is why I've kind of put this slide up here. These are the steps that you need to take. Figure out the portions of our online training that can be converted to interactive webinar format as knowledge reinforcement and question time. Sounds good. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because usually knowledge reinforcement, I'm trying to think about, I think I know what you're saying. You're saying you want to have some more interactive time in your webinar to answer questions and figure out how to revisit some of that material. If that's not right, please go ahead and type in there and let me know if I misunderstood what you were saying. Dawn, create some pre-assessments in our LMS for my fall term classes. Perfect, yeah, because the more data you have going into your instruction, the more tailored your instruction can be. I would recommend formative assessments as you go through as well, just consistent formative assessments. Love the flipped classroom strategy, how to use webinars, Zoom conferences to accomplish the goals of the flipped classroom. Yeah, it's really just thinking about it differently, right? If it's a synchronous format, then you still can have a flipped classroom. It's really just asynchronous to synchronous. You can use Zoom as a classroom. There are a few tips you'll need to take into consideration. We just actually created a resource of how to convert your training from a support, because it's for FPG and they mostly are supporting communities rather than calling it training exactly, but the goal is the same, behavior change. So we just created a resource for how to convert that I'm going to try to figure out, maybe Jamie or Leanne can suggest a way that I could provide a URL for that resource afterward. Is there a way we could sample your webinar that you created and referenced in this presentation? I'm not sure what you mean by sample, like you would want all of the slides of the webinar. I'm not sure that I would be able to provide you the entire webinar, but I guess more to the point, I'm not really sure it would help, because I don't think that your goals would be the same unless you are an implementation capacity project. But essentially, it's really just utilizing the same materials that we created for on-site and just putting them up on the screen. So the materials should be simple and easy anyway. The online training, this is MK Jansen. The online training is for pet care, so it can be very helpful to practice with your own pets or watch the animal handling happen in real time with immediate feedback and guidance. Yes, so I'm thinking the online training, meaning like asynchronous online training, and you're going to put a follow-up webinar Zoom synchronous component or on-site component if you're able to do that afterward. How to give meds to cats. Yeah, I'm going to have to learn that too. I've got a 19-year-old cat who's healthy right now, but could be not tomorrow. That would be great. Yeah, these are fantastic ideas, y'all. I love this. I think blended learning is something that is so easy to do poorly. And I think that doing it well when people say take existing knowledge into consideration and seamlessly blend your instructional components together by using learner data, I think that can be really intimidating. But I think as you're just writing this out, you're kind of figuring out how you can do that for yourselves, and that's fantastic. Well, I know our time is running out. So I want to thank you all for being here and for having some interest in this topic. I know this topic is going to become more and more important as we, over the next year, have to go, in and out of online experiences. And it's been my pleasure to bring what's been working for us to you. I would love for this knowledge to just kind of cascade outward. And I'd also like to remain available.
All right, and
if
thank
you all
you,
have
Wendy,
any
for
follow-up
a really
questions after
informative
this.
and
So
interesting
thank you so
session.
much for
As we
being here.
wrap up
It was
here,
a pleasure.
we are going to